Welcome to Libeth. This week we are reading Japanese fairy tales by Yei Theodora Ozaki, a book published in 1903 that most people have never heard of, and that almost everyone who knows Japanese mythology has passed through without realizing it. It is the book that gave the English-speaking world its first sustained encounter with the stories of the crane wife, Urashima Taro, Momotaro, and a dozen other figures who have since become some of the most recognizable images in global popular culture. And it was written not by a Japanese scholar, not by a folklorist with a methodology, but by a half-British, half-Japanese woman navigating two civilizations that were in the middle of remaking themselves and each other. That fact is not incidental to what the book is. It is the book. Yei Theodora Ozaki was born in 1871 to a Japanese diplomat father and a British mother. She grew up between cultures, never fully settled in either, which is both the biographical fact and the interpretive key to everything she produced. When she compiled and rewrote these tales, she was not a folklorist with a methodology. She was a translator in the deepest sense, not between languages, but between imaginative worlds. And like all translators, she left fingerprints on everything she touched. The stories in this collection are real. Their roots go back 1,000 years, into the oral traditions of the Heian court, the peasant communities of the Kamakura period, the merchant culture of the Edo era. But what Ozaki gave to Western readers was not those stories in their original register. It was a version of those stories made legible, softened at the edges, morally clarified, emotionally tidied, dressed in the vocabulary of Victorian sentiment without quite losing the structural bones of something much older and stranger beneath. This matters because the bones are what we are here for. The bones are what the whole series is about. What you are going to encounter across these videos is not a survey of Japanese fairy tales as charming folklore. It is an attempt to read what these stories are doing structurally, philosophically, historically. What they reveal about the civilization that produced them and the civilization that received them. Because fairy tales are never just entertainment. They are the operating manuals of a culture. They encode the answers a society has settled on, provisionally, to the questions it cannot stop asking. What do you owe the dead? What happens when desire and duty collide? What does the universe do with goodness, and what does it do with greed? These are not decorative questions. They are the load-bearing walls of any social order, and fairy tales are one of the places you can see them most clearly, precisely because they are told without pretending to be philosophy. The historical ground beneath these stories spans 4 distinct periods of Japanese civilization, and each one left its sediment in the tales. The Heian period, running from 794 to 1185, was a world organized around the imperial court in Kyoto, around aesthetic refinement as a form of spiritual practice, around a particular understanding of beauty and impermanence that the Japanese call mono no aware, the pathos of things. The Kamakura period that followed it, from 1185 to 1333, broke that world open. Military power displaced court power, the samurai class rose, and the values encoded in the tales shifted accordingly. Loyalty, martial virtue, the capacity for sacrifice, these entered the moral vocabulary of the stories during this era. The Muromachi period, running through the 14th and 15th centuries, was a time of increasing fragmentation and civil conflict, and it left in the tales a residue of chaos just barely held at bay by personal virtue. And the Edo period, The long, stable era of Tokugawa rule from 1603 to 1868 is perhaps most visibly present in the collection's overall moral architecture. The rigid social hierarchy, the honest peasant as the emblem of virtue, the merchant class's ambiguous relationship to wealth and status. By the time Ozaki was writing, all of this had been shattered and rebuilt. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had dismantled the Tokugawa order almost overnight. Japan was modernizing at a pace that had no real historical parallel, adopting Western legal codes, building railways, reforming the military, sending students to Europe and America. And in the middle of all this, some people were asking, as people always do during rapid transformation, what are we underneath all this change? What remains? The answer Ozaki's book implicitly offered to Western readers, but also to anyone watching Japan from outside or inside, was that Japan remained a civilization organized around particular values, particular relationships to nature and duty and the supernatural, that had survived 1,000 years of political upheaval and would survive modernization too. Whether that was true or consoling or both is something the book cannot answer. But the asking of it gives the collection its historical weight. The structure of this series follows the architecture of that question. We will begin with the world the stories come from, not as background but as pressure, as the social and political systems that made certain stories necessary to tell. We will then move through the book's narrative architecture, its characters, its literal and figurative registers, before arriving at the two thematic clusters that organize everything. The cluster concerned with duty, virtue, and the moral economy of reward and punishment, and the cluster concerned with the spirit world, the natural world, and the terrifying fragility of happiness. Each of these is a lens. Together, they are a way of seeing what Ozaki's collection actually is. Not a charming Victorian curiosity, but a document of a civilization thinking about itself at the moment of its greatest transformation, filtered through someone who was herself a version of that transformation. What you are going to find across this series is that the stories in this collection are doing something far more precise and far more demanding than charming a Victorian readership with the exotic East. They are encoding a particular civilization's answers to questions that do not go away, about what you owe the dead, about what happens when desire and duty pull in opposite directions, about what the universe does with goodness, and what it does with greed. Ozaki's frame sits over all of it, softening some edges, sentimentalizing some moments. But the bones beneath her prose are 1,000 years old, and bones do not lie. Next week, we go into the world that made these stories necessary, the social and political systems of Japan across 4 centuries, the structures of power and family and community that these tales were, in some sense, written to survive. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.